Good morning, good morning. It's a quiet crowd. Okay, all right.
Good morning. There it is.
Thank you. Let's get started. Lush Cosmetics North America respectfully recognizes that our business operates on Indigenous territory across Turtle Island. Today we are on the ancestral homelands of the Plains tribes, including the Humanos, Culiacan, Comanche, Lipan Apache, and Takawa people. The Takawa people lived in central Texas, and the Comanche and Apache moved through this area. We acknowledge that our facilities, along with our settler and newcomer staff, are guests on this land as we act to repair harm. We do it together in allyship with Indigenous peoples everywhere, including our staff, customers, and with leadership from the organizations and communities that we work with. As we begin, I pay respect to the people of the Plains tribes, past, present, and future. I'm Carlene Pickard. I'm your moderator to today's session and the Advocacy and Activism Manager at Lush Cosmetics. So what's a soap company doing hosting a conversation with this bold title, Freedom of Speech or Freedom to Hate? Well, as a billion-dollar global company, after 3 years of leaving most social media platforms, all Meta platforms and X, we have an ongoing interest in conversations about the questions we posed in this session description. Should we hold those who use online speech to incite violence to account in the same way we hold the perpetrators of violence to account? Should the companies who allow hate speech also be held accountable? And is social media really moving us towards freedom or towards division and hate? At Lush, we call ourselves a campaigning company. We stand bold and firm in our commitment to human rights, animal protection, and environmental justice. In this year alone, some 90 days into 2025, this has meant affirming our commitment to freedom of movement and supporting undocumented people in this country. Saying the words DEIB out loud and supporting Greenpeace in their defense against Energy Transfer's slap suit against the organization. The latter sounds a little wonky, but basically we believe that no corporation should be chasing after an organization that is supporting fossil fuel extraction. So we're fortunate to invite two incredible women to be with us today. Their bios fall short of their amazingness, so please follow and support them where they are. First to my right is Nora Benavides, the Digital Director of Justice and Civil Rights at did I say that right? No, the Director of Digital and Justice and Civil Rights at Free Press, which seeks to change the media to transform democracy to realize a just society. And then next to her is Deja Fox, is a trailblazer at the intersection of social justice and social media, making waves as a voice for her generation. She's the founder of Gen Z Girl Gang, a thriving community championing the power of young women to support and uplift each other. And also today is technically one of my bosses, Jack Constantine, the CDO of Lush Cosmetics. Hi, Jack.
Hiya.
As Chief Digital Officer, Jack believes his part of the business should be responsible for finding tech solutions that make Lush and the wider world a better, fairer, and more sustainable place. 3 years ago, Jack led Lush's move to remove itself from social media platforms that don't take user safety seriously. So with that stage set, let's get things going. Nora, this moment in time has actually been a disaster in the making. Your work has diligently tracked this demise. Can you take us back in time and highlight some of the key moments that have brought us here?
Well, it's wonderful to be here with all of you, and I promise I won't go as far back as the 1400s because we don't have time, though I love that. I guess it doesn't feel like that far-fetched to imagine that, you know, a social media site like Facebook that started as a way to rank girls and how hot they were on college campuses, it's not that far a leap to then see where we are now. And as much as there's been a lot of promise with the internet age, you remember the Obama era, the feeling that people were connected, that we could all somehow aspire to more because of our ability to connect with each other online. I actually think that what we're seeing is, like all systems, the ability for social media in particular to be weaponized. And it's kind of a bleak topic when you really dig into this, because what we've seen is that platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, all of these companies operate really with the concern for their bottom line. So they push often some of the most toxic, violative, misleading, and harmful content. Not everyone's experience will be identical in that way, but over the last many years, there's been a lot of pressure from civil society, from activists around the world to push these platforms to do better, for companies to really invest in what we call trust and safety. And that's the idea that our expression and our safety online should be protected, that these companies, when they open up space for us to practice and engage in speech, really should be protecting us in certain ways. And what we've seen actually is that a number of moments have led to where we are now. In particular, I would point to the most recent of Elon Musk acquiring Twitter. And his actions, his extreme, pointed interest in certain speech, and his desire to gut that platform and make it something that promotes the views he likes, have actually incentivized other platforms. I sometimes feel it's like a race to the bottom. He created this new sub-basement for bad behavior. And a lot of these platforms have said, well, as long as we're not as bad as that, it's okay. But in the mix, they're all now at a basement level. And so over the last 2 years, a lot of what we've done at Free Press is study the ways that these platforms have fired staff, a lot of those the critical content moderation and trust and safety professionals. We've seen the ways that these platforms promote VIPs like Trump and often other authoritarian leaders around the world. And we've also seen the ways that they've removed their own policies, like the ability to moderate or remove content about COVID lies. And so where do we go, from all of that? It really feels like many of us just deal with more gross toxicity. And I'm curious ultimately what the experiences of others will be, because I go on each of these platforms now, and I personally, and in the research we've done, have seen the ways that toxicity rose. The first week that Elon Musk bought Twitter, the use of the N-word rose over 400%. And that was a lot of bad actors just testing the edges of how far they could take the platform. And then, I think the last thing I'll say now is we're not just dealing with a kind of passive willingness to promote or even just feature bad content. What we're really seeing is an effort by people like Elon Musk, who has gone after researchers. He's brought lawsuits against many of the organizations I work with closely. And when they promote or produce research that expose the ways that his brand, his content is featured next to neo-Nazi content, he sues them. And so when we're really here to talk about free speech, I think we have to talk about power. And what does it mean when one of the richest people in the world bought a platform to shape and wield public narrative globally? And then he basically bought the presidency. And when we're really looking out at what's coming, I think we have to look at that asymmetry, where some of the few people with the most money are creating, crafting, and manipulating the narratives and the environments that we all live in to their liking. And so I hope we really can get into that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I think a bit of the history and then a bit of like what we should be thinking about, like what we're thinking about right now. So Deja, I'm curious also to bring you in. I think Nora is sort of asking too your experience of as someone who's grown up using this platform or these platforms and really built a community that you're working to engage and empower and uplift. How are things feeling for you right now in this current context and moment?
Yeah. I mean, my origin story on the internet I was born in the year 2000, so I'm, of the digital generation. I got my first Facebook when I was 11, and I had my first viral video when I was 16. And I think about how when I was just a 15-year-old girl getting started in activism, my start came from a very personal place of moving out, experiencing something that 1 in 30 teens in the US do, hidden homelessness, and sitting in a sex ed class where the baseball coach was teaching. I was getting curriculum from the 80s. No one mentioned consent. And I got my start activating at school board levels, telling my story. And it wasn't until 2016, a year later, at 16 years old, under the first Trump administration, and his attempts to roll back Title X funding, which was the funding I used when I had no parents and no money and no insurance, to go into a Planned Parenthood clinic and leave with the birth control I needed to take control of my body and my future. And so I had this moment where I went to my senator. Someone in the crowd at a town hall, which we've seen a lot of this lately, was recording, and I asked him why he, as a white man, was making these decisions about me and my body. And he told me he supported policies that support the American dream. And I asked him why he would deny me the American dream. And I woke up the next day and millions had seen this video. And so I tell that story, which is both my activism origin story and sort of my internet origin story, because it was this time on the internet where I really deeply believed in the promise of the internet. Because I saw what it was like to be a 16-year-old girl working at a gas station, on my own, and be on even footing in the public discourse with the United States Senator. And I just want that to sink in for a bit, because in the course of history, that's pretty unthinkable. And that is the promise of the internet, which I think is actually, in some ways, why we do this work, because it can and should be better. It should democratize who gets to be a storyteller, right? We should have the people who are the most impacted by these issues out in the front, right? And yet, we are in a moment now, nearly a decade later, jump scare, in which these platforms are swinging to the right. And they're censoring information when it comes to reproductive rights. And for content creators like me, it has become increasingly difficult to use these platforms to create change and to build a community.
Oh, thanks. A lot of follow-up things that I'm thinking, but first, so we'll come back. But first, I'm wondering, Jack, if you could speak a little bit to the thought process that you went through, particularly with our decision to jump off social 3 years ago. Just sort of bouncing off what Deja said, because I think it's very around the same time, right? When, as Nora's kind of walked through, what we were thinking at that time 3 years ago.
Yeah, so my journey in Lush, I've always kind of been the digital advocate. My parents are co-founders of the company. I was the young millennial at the time who turned up in a leadership meeting and said, "We need to be getting on social. This is where everyone is." And so I kind of initiated Lush's journey into social media, which in the beginning, it was the dream. It was a free landscape that customers and communities could engage with brands that you felt you could. Lush has always been very word of mouth. It's been kind of very interactive with the community, and those early days, you really felt like we suddenly had this access to global communities, and it was really great start. And then things started to turn, and I started to question. For me, I started questioning things 5 years ago. After probably a decade of, building things. And you get to a point, especially as a brand, where what you're starting to do is chase the numbers. Everyone's starting to really focus on that you're kind of caught in the machine of what social media's trying to promise you. And I think under the bonnet, it started to become clear that there were some issues around what's actually going on. Are people safe? Is their data safe? What's happening with Cambridge Analytica scandal? And then, these revelations come out of Francis Hogan, and so you get these whistleblowers and this information that starts to tell you the people running these organizations are not looking after their users' best interests. And as you've heard, in the real world, Lush is very, very aware of how we turn up and how we work with the world around us and the way that we can be a business for good. And I've always been that kind of advocate from a digital side. How can I help Lush navigate that journey on digital platforms and the way that we show up? And it just felt like it wasn't right for us to show up on these platforms anymore when they weren't really looking after the users. Exactly what's been said about the types of content that could appear, the harmful nature of it, especially because when you are a brand, you are one of the people who are on these platforms that customers and community members are coming on that platform to see. So then they might be coming to see a Lush thing, but what is going to appear after a Lush post, and where are they going to end up on these platforms? So it just became somewhere that felt very unreliable and unsafe. And really, we wanted to focus on, and I wanted to focus on, creating a safe space for Lush and our communities to be able to actually communicate with each other. And it wasn't an easy decision. There was a lot, obviously, I think what grew, where social media grew so in such power, in the sense that businesses kind of lean into it to the degree that they feel they have to be on there, to make a decision like saying, we're going to come off. I mean, when I first did it as an experiment in the UK 5 years ago, I basically said, right, we're going to do the social switch up. The press we got was insane. I did not know that I'd just opened Pandora's box. It was like, why does everyone care that Lush is coming off of, like, this is mad how much attention this is getting. It's like you've kind of found a sore point and poked it, and then you're like, oh, okay, there's a reaction. So I felt like I was onto something. And then, 3 years ago, we once we'd done more research, got more information, seen all the data, it was like, we've got to come off of this, at a global scale. And we made that commitment. And then 2 years ago, we were actually at South by Southwest. We had Lush House, and that was our focus there was big tech rebellion, which at the time probably felt a little bit premature because a lot of it was about rebelling against the big tech giants and those people we all saw in the inauguration, stood on the front row. But, it feels like now, very prevalent time, we can see kind of like the blindfold's been lifted off, and we can see these people for who they are and what they've been using these platforms for, and how we have ended up being kind of just used within that whole machine. And so, my dedication is, how do we as Lush show up in digital spaces that we deem as safe? How do we create safe digital spaces? How can we engage with our communities? And don't get me wrong, we have found it challenging not having access to social to be able to engage with our communities who do care about connecting with us. And we are constantly building and figuring out ways to improve the way that we can engage with our communities digitally. But I think where we are is a much stronger foundations. And I think a lot of businesses this year are going to be thinking, what do they need to do next? So I feel like we're a little bit ahead. We've kind of made some steps. We've got some foundations. We've still got a long way to go, but I feel like we're in a good place to be able to build safe spaces that we think our digital communities can interact with us, and we're not going to be in these dangerous environments, which I think they are genuinely dangerous. And we've seen that with the impact of what can happen and how this kind of content that people can get served in these algorithms can lead to, ending your life or at the worst. And so we've seen the damage that this type of media can have if it's not managed properly, if the content moderation isn't in place, if things aren't actually taken seriously.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great place there. I wanted to make sure everybody knows that Free Press and Nora have been part of these really incredible reports that have been really influential, I think, to me and for us to think about how to navigate exactly the way that Jack is saying. We've been wanting to think about the business engaging digitally, but not on the platforms. So, the first being Empty Promises, which is a great report. And then more recently, the Big Tech Backslide. So where, Jack is saying around, proposed regulation or ways to kind of put some brakes on some of the platforms. I know that's also something you all thought about in Big Tech Backslide. So I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, well, it's a real rarity when someone else brings up my report, so I'm really excited to hear it. And, these were honestly born out of just watching what was happening in real time. The first report, Empty Promises, my company published in 2022, and we were looking at what the influence of social media companies was on the midterm elections. And in particular, how were the biggest social media companies behaving? Were they living up to their own promises of, let's say they had a number of policies in place, did they actually apply them? And back then, what we found was that it's really hard to even understand what these companies are doing. I think that's by design. I often call it distraction by design or something else, something pithy, but it's really so hard for someone who's even an expert in this to sift through blog posts, press releases, policy statements, updates on policy statements, blog posts about the updates on the policy statements. I mean, it's like this labyrinth. And for every platform, I'm sure most of you aren't going through Meta or Instagram or TikTok or you name it platform to look at what they're doing with their policies. So they kind of exist in a very light free-for-all where we don't quite know how they're doing, what they're doing, and frankly, if they're not doing the work that they promised to do. What we found in that report was that, the kinds of safeguards companies like Meta, TikTok, Twitter, YouTube should have in place, many times they say they do, and then while that's on paper, they ultimately, across the board, have been failing to apply those policies rigorously. And it really feels kind of like their own negligence in a way. They say they'll do one thing and then they do another, which is in many ways a hallmark actually of the kind of ethos we're now seeing, bully leaders around the world who say one thing and do another. And I think Jack said it really well, that front row visual that we saw at the inauguration of these billionaire, all men, individuals sitting there who purchased their seat in front of the cabinet. And so fast forward throughout the years, we've continued doing that research to examine how social media impacts the real world. And maybe that sounds silly, honestly, because I feel I live in Groundhog Day of always having to describe to people why the online world affects our real world. I think Deja did a great job of describing how the digital world is such a potent and promising place sometimes. And it's also that sordid underbelly of horrible toxicity. And I think one of the grossest harms is really this issue around data. And when we get into it, we explore it a lot in our Big Tech Backslide report. But I just want to spend one moment on this because the amount of data that these companies have access to and what they do with that data. They retain that data, they analyze it, they store it, they sell it sometimes, they leverage ads that will then be micro-targeted with laser-like precision for each of us. Most of us are placed into cohorts on platforms that we don't even know about. And depending on the racial or ethnic breakdown and assumptions that these platforms make, we either see or don't see certain content. And there's really a kind of digital civil rights reality now. I marched with John Lewis all the time. I've sued Donald Trump for his retaliation of the press. It's sort of odd when people say, well, why do you work on tech now? And I try to explain this is the frontier for the way we have access and opportunity in the real world. And the way that the data collected about each of us shapes our reality. And most of us are either unaware completely or only a little aware, and for the most part are fine with it. Because if I search for cowboy boots in Austin and then I get ads regularly, that's a great thing, right? Then it saves time, so it's easy. And I think it's important that we rigorously take back control of our lives and our digital footprint, because these companies have exploited us. We are the product. We are absolutely the thing that they are commodifying. And they've not only made money off of it, but made a host of global changes that I think we've really tried to explore in all of our research, pointing to this really weird link between these billionaires, these sort of what they call the broligarchy, and the ways that those men in particular shape what we think of, what we feel are the choices we've come to naturally. So I hope we can get into more of that, because I'll go as deep as you want to go on the power dynamics that shape who we are. But I think it's something that we do not naturally come to. Like each of us sitting here, I just pull out my phone and I don't even think about it. And so it's really wonderful to see a range of actors here who aren't actually in the civil rights space coming to this and talking about it. That's really what we need. We need a diverse and wide flank of people and corporations who are standing up in ways that I'm so excited Lush is. I've loved Lush forever, but I think it's really a powerful statement. And I think ultimately we're gonna see consumers falling and just falling in love with that. You know, the ability for companies to put their money where their values are.
Thanks. So Deja, I wanted to pick up where you left off, which was the changes that you're seeing now, and maybe if you could talk about how, like the changes that you're seeing within, you know, the Gen Z girl gang, and how that's impacting how you think you're using social moving forward.
Yeah, I resonate with you, the point you're making here that our digital realities, whether it be what our algorithms are serving us or who has, access to views, shapes not just our lived experiences, but elections and economies, right? And so to answer your question around Gen Z Girl Gang, I'm gonna tell another story. We're gonna zoom ahead from that viral video in 2016 to a pretty serious moment in 2021. So in the interim, social media did incredible things for me. The essay that I wrote on my little phone while I was at work at the gas station got me into college. I was the first in my family to go to college. I studied media in college. I got an Instagram DM with a job description for a position on a digital team for Kamala Harris, and became one of the youngest presidential staffers in history, all because of this connection I made with someone, thank you, on the internet, and the expertise I built as a young person using social in interesting ways. I made some of my best friends through Gen Z Girl Gang, this digital community I started out of my college dorm, because, you know, you can imagine, I went to Columbia, and I encountered a kind of wealth that I didn't know existed when I got there, and I had to re-examine what community meant to me. It wasn't the people who lived near me anymore, right? I'd always thought family, neighbors, friends. And for me, instead, it was these young women I was meeting online, many of whom I had never even met in real life, who were supporting me through this very difficult transition. And so the story I'm gonna take you to now is after all of those incredible things that social media made possible for me, all of those incredible doors they opened. In 2021, in the height of the pandemic, I woke up one day to a tweet, a photo of me, and just 4 words, "New enemy just dropped" on Twitter. And it was then inundated by a cyber mob, which is a kind of digital violence. And my socials were flooded with hate comments, my emails, everything. And if you can just imagine what it's like to be 20 years old and isolated by this pandemic, right? And reach for your phone because it's also your alarm, and see threats to your personal safety or, your information, to see people making comments about how you look, your body, or even, just a sense of self or ideas that you're just coming to build. And I think that's one of the most insidious pieces of this experience of growing up online, is that I actually couldn't tell you what it would be like, who I would be, if I didn't have that constant feedback, because I'll never know a reality without it. And you don't have to be an influencer with hundreds of thousands of followers and millions of views to be impacted by that reality, right? Your nieces, your daughters are growing up never having known a world without instant feedback on how they look, who they are, what they think. And the story I'm gonna share now is that Gen Z Girl Gang, one of my best friends, Maya, who I'd never met in real life in 2021, had the solution for me in this moment of cyber mob when the platforms failed to. She sent me a text and she was like, give me your passwords. I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna delete those hateful comments and DMs before you have to see them. And I share that story to say that we need people fighting it out and legislators doing their job to legislate. But in my view, it is teen girls who have been showing up for each other, who have been innovating underneath the constraints of these platforms and subverting what have been designed for profit making into community building tools, true community building tools. And I think when we look to the solution, how do we get out of here? And I mean, we do need to get out of here. We need to not see teen girls as the victims in this story, but instead the people who might be able to save us. Because they're digital natives. There's no world they've ever known aside from this, and they have been making a way out of no way on an internet that was absolutely not built for them.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. I'm, deeply sorry that that happened. Shouldn't happen to anyone.
True, but alas.
Nora, can we go back to power? I think given Deja's story and just maybe a zoom out perspective of what do we do? Where do we go? Who do we look to and lean on for what we do next?
Yeah, I haven't talked a lot about the real deep psychological harm and the types of people online that I think are what we know are more aggressively affected by hate online. I'm really glad. It sounds like an awful experience, but I think what Deja explained encapsulates exactly what we kind of know, which is women, people of color, LGBTQ plus members of our community, immigrants, non-English users are asymmetrically affected by hate and lies on social media. And what we are told by those who run these companies is that we are largely part of a problem of promoting false content, that we are somehow creating our own false narratives. In a word, I think it's the most sophisticated form of corporate gaslighting, to gut fact-checking at private social media companies while saying that conservative speech is being targeted and has to be saved. And when each of us digest those types of stories daily or regularly, we begin to believe them. And it's important that we have people who tell their stories, people who have courage, like Deja, to describe what it really means to be the subject and target of harassment. Because this story, when we talk about power, is a story about oppression, and it is a story about suppressing people's stories. So I think it's important that we have the ability to come together. I'm a lawyer. I can always talk about the law for anyone who wants to afterwards. But right now, we are in such a tenuous global moment regarding our democracies worldwide. And I don't think we can rely on leaders alone to save us. We have to be the ones to save ourselves. And that comes from real people power. It comes from communities that are coming together. I often say, whatever your sphere of influence is, know it, use it, meet up with people. It can be coffee, it can be dinner, it can be literally us after this panel just chatting. If it's Uber, talk with your Uber driver. Media has, of course, a major role, and a lot of my work is on coaching and working with journalists and the media on how to help hold to account those in power. And then I think brands, and I really believe brands have such an amazing moment right now. I think you're about to see an explosion, truly, of consumers who are excited about brands that believe in something and believe in people. So I always say we have to know what our people power is. If you feel powerless, that's part of the goal. And a lot of why social media has thrived so much is exactly what Deja said. It's the hormonal sense that we are isolated, and any engagement we're getting, our dopamine thrives, we are immediately pulled back in. But digital life is not real life, and we have to mobilize in person. You have to learn about your local community politics. You have to learn about what people believe who live next door to you. I mean, we're really in the beginning of the life cycle that we're always in, of fighting for justice and trying to bring our communities together. So wherever you are, even if it feels like you're powerless, what I say is, start small, but start now.
Thanks. Yeah. Speaking to my activism heart. So Jack, can we, I don't want to, I mean, you're the chief digital officer, but the last 3 years have been really interesting at Lush, right? Like I feel like we've had a stance, which is we're going to go off social platforms, but then we've also been trying to have internal conversations about what would this look like, or could we go a little way this way, and have kind of consistently come back to the stance that we took 3 years ago. But I wonder if you could do that, like behind the curtain. Like it hasn't been as cut and dry as like we're off social. That's it. Everyone fall in line.
I've been quite disliked in Lush for my stance because of the fact that it's a complex topic. People don't know or understand what's under the bonnet, and they just think, "What are you doing? Why have you done that to our business? This is going to limit us. Why are you limiting our ability to reach people?" And you can try and talk about the topic. It's much easier when you can, as I can now, show a photograph of an inauguration. Then everyone's like, "Oh, okay, right, I understand." But before that moment, it was like, they're just platforms. What's your problem? So it's been a difficult journey. We constantly assess it. Everything about what we've decided is putting together parameters about how we do judge different platforms. What's the criteria? We're still on YouTube. That's still a question. Should we be on YouTube? So we are constantly juggling and navigating our way through this. And it has been a difficult time, I would say, as a brand, kind of, I suppose, discovering what our route forward is when, you do feel that you're slightly limited because of the nature of how everyone is interacting on these platforms. But to your point about the power, because in a way you kind of as a brand almost feel a bit powerless because you're like, well, we're stuck too, so we can't now reach the people on the other side. But what you realize is that's just because some middlemen got in the way. Like they don't have, if more brands and businesses did what we did, because one of our main principles there was that, we have some power here actually, and we can make a choice and we can decide we're not going to go on those platforms, and they are going to suffer for that to a small degree, whatever degree. And imagine if another 20 companies did that. Imagine if another 500 companies did that. That would suddenly have quite a big impact on these platforms. And then put that on the other side, and imagine if all the users came off. All of a sudden, actually, these platforms that have got us in a headlock would no longer be the ones holding the power. And to your point, that the reality is they don't really have the power. If we truly understood it, every individual here has the power. We're all on there. They're empty shells. They're only as good as what we put in there. There's nothing else to them. And do we have good alternatives? No, we don't have good alternatives right now. And I think they're coming. There's some nice, I think, that's my big hope for this year, is that we'll see more democratization of platforms, like less of these massive big tech giants that have kind of monopolized the entire digital landscape. I think brands are already exploring their own platforms. That's what we're doing. Where we know the kind of intricacies and the depth of how we build our technology from the ground up. We build things open source. We build things ourselves. We want to have, we have our own app, our own platforms. And we can manage and moderate those platforms. So we are going to integrate more social features. We are going to integrate more ways that our fans can come to us and we can offer them that safe space. So I think it is about exploring and understanding where the power shift is and how to move. And I think, another great point you made about businesses in this particular era is, in some ways, it's quite exciting, because what actually is going to happen, as we're seeing, I was at dinner last night talking about the DE&I retreat that's kicking in, and for Lush, we'll never back down from that point, and that is because it's a core belief. We've renamed 3 of our bath bombs diversity, equity, and inclusion in the US, and we'll keep standing for those rights because we believe they are critical. And so those types of decisions will define what brands you will choose to go with. And I think it's divisive. There will be some people who do not like that decision. But actually, it's important to know as a brand where you stand and why you're making a decision. And then people can make their minds up if they're with you or against you. But at least you have something you're standing for. So, yeah, it's an interesting time because the volatility almost creates a sense of you do need to choose a little bit now. Like who do you align with as a brand, and who do you feel understands you and is there for you, which is what we are always about inherently. Like I said, Lush wants to create safe spaces. If you've ever been in a Lush shop, you'll get inundated with staff who are there desperately wanting to help you. And that environment is something we cherish, that human interaction, as we spoke to before, and some of those benefits some of this is about the digital social interaction, but also we have 900 locations across the world, 15,000 staff, like ways that we can actually engage with customers in the real world. That is also an important aspect of how we turn up and what activism looks like locally and what we can do to kind of build that community and that network. And then what digital tools can we layer in that will support that journey and provide ways that is more accessible. I think, it's definitely been a challenging time, but I'm quite excited about where I think we are going to go. And there's definitely some dangerous territory of what I think is coming, but, it'd be really interesting to see where brands land on which side of the fence on some of these topics.
Thanks. So I think we have a bit of time for questions. If folks have some, start thinking about them now. There's a microphone I'm going to ask you to go to if you have questions. But I think to sort of do the last round, I think, Jack, you sort of talked about where we go next and what the future is. I know, we're watching, which I never used to love as a brand. We're just watching it. But I think there's so much, I like definitive action. But I do think that it's been really interesting in the last couple of years as things have changed and, arguably for the worse. So I wanted to ask you two fabulous women to sort of take us out on a what's next, like this conversation, Deja. How's that? How is it landing for you, and what are you thinking about, with your life moving forward with this, incredibly inherently tied social life and public life and wanting community and building community through the digital life?
Yeah, when I figure out what I'm doing with my life, I'll be sure to let everyone here know. I'm just a girl figuring it out. But here's what I do know. Me and my friends are tired of the structures that we're being forced in on these apps, right? The idea that you have one person and you should have the goal to be amassing millions of views and millions of followers, people that you'll never meet or engage with or know, is not what we are craving. So at Gen Z Girl Gang, some of the moves that we've made have been to move off platform, build communities in places like Discord, platforms that value density, right? Where the value of your community is not just in how many followers you have, but how engaged is the community with itself, with each other. We also, one of the platforms I'm really interested in, and I think there is a space for emerging platforms in this moment. We've seen migrations from X or Twitter or whatever to Blue Sky or TikTok to Red Note, right? Young people are ready to move. We are fed up and ready to go. We just need alternatives. And I don't mean replacements, because that's its own fight, right? And maybe the monopoly internet is not the landscape we want to replicate, but we should have choices. And so I've been keeping my eye on the ways that the girl internet has been building out on its own, right? I think of places like Sunroom, which you should look up after this, which is a space built for girls to get paid to exist. They're responding to the fact that in this visual landscape, platforms are commodifying women's beauty, but shaming them for monetizing it. So they're building their own space. Or DM. DM is a social search engine that is built by women to feel like you're in a girl's bathroom at 1 a.m. just chit-chatting. And every conversation in that app trains it to better understand how to respond to you. And they are filling a real hole. Actually, 25% of their searches are about reproductive rights. And that makes sense in a landscape where that information is being censored on major platforms. And their searches went up by 700% in the days following the 2025 inauguration. So there is a hunger and a willingness from young people to migrate. We just need to build where they're headed. And so I actually think that's a very hopeful place to land, is that we need to be investing in builders, not just critiquing the problem.
Okay, I'm not going to get too bleak, I promise.
We should have done it the other direction.
I was like, I got to couch this. Okay. First, I am excited about questions, and I hope that women come forward with questions, because every panel I have seen while I've been here, only men have asked questions. So if you have a question and you're a woman, please come up. Please, like, no question is stupid. Okay, I want to talk and close by really describing how we respond to fragility, because that's, I think, what we're up against. And all of our systems are fragile. We are fragile. Our psyches are vulnerable to a number of things. And so over the coming years, we're going to see Trump allies try to buy up news organizations and outlets. We've seen that in other countries like Hungary, where Orban and the leadership party, they bought up news organizations to create an acceptable narrative. We've seen efforts to put judicial age caps on federal judges in other countries like Poland, so that suddenly those in power can put in place an entire bench of judges that will support and advance their views. We will see attacks on protesters. We see that every time there is an authoritarian takeover of any sort around the world, a kind of narrowing of what is considered acceptable speech. So if we're really here to talk about freedom of speech, we have to look at what that assault looks like around the world and what we can anticipate. Those are daunting realities, I think, that we have before us. I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted just thinking about it. And every day feels like a nonstop assault on civil rights, human rights, free expression. And so the reason I want to close by talking about fragility is because in this moment, the point is to exhaust us. And we have to be able to recognize that. And the real power is in coming back together. Social media is one of many tools and systems that are just ripe for the picking for weaponization. And so we can't rely on any one new alternative platform or any one new futurist community. We have to really rely on each other. And we have to name what the threat is. And when the threat is this sense of bigotry, of misogyny, of wanting to silence and put down communities around the world, we have to name it. If we're just sort of out there, saying, well, social media, it's a thing, it's kind of a problem. The reason that I'm so insistent and excited about brands stepping up is because I actually think it's a form of a new sector that's naming that's the threat. And we are putting our money where our value is, that people matter. So every time you go out today, every time you move forward in thinking through what this dynamic is, you see an example, some kind of red flag of the ways that democracies die, name it. Name it with people around you, and then find the ways that you can come together. Because the only solution to fragile systems and psyches is by recognizing it and saying we're actually going to become stronger. And so we have to come together. That can be on new platforms, that can be in real life, hopefully it's in real life, but that is the only way forward, is together.
Thank you. That's great, right? That's good. Join me in thanking them for a great panel. Thanks. Yeah, do some Q&A. Thanks. Welcome.
Hello.
Hey.
Hello. Thank you so much for this panel. I didn't really know what to expect from Lush Cosmetics talking about freedom of speech, but this was definitely
You thought we were just
interesting.
going to give you all soap,
Loved
right?
it, loved it. So my name is Julia. I work with the European Commission on the Digital Services Act. So I would like to speak a bit about regulation. You mentioned it a bit. So for me, all of this discussion really ends up being about incentives, because it's very hard to discuss this very societal, public, important issues when at the end of the day companies respond to investors' requests and investors' demands. So regulation is really the way that, at least for us in Europe, in the European Union, we've been trying to, well, create some actual accountability and transparency around the obligations that these platforms have and the way that they operate. It's not easy because content moderation is a very sensitive, polarized space where to move from. So the approach we've been taking is about system, it's about processes, it's about due diligence. But, you know, especially in this political time, it's kind of a hard space to move into. So yeah, I would like to hear your thoughts. So maybe you do know about the DSA, you have some perspectives to share. Whether you do know how the space, regulatory speaking, is going to develop here in the US, because also free speech advocates and overall accusation of censorship have been quite strong already in the new administration. So
Thank you.
Interested to hear your thoughts.
Great, thanks. We have 2, 4, 6, yeah, so a handful of more questions after, and looking at our clock here, we have a hard stop. So let's do 2 minutes for each, and then for you remaining folks as well, you'll be part of that 2 minutes. So go.
Okay. Everyone else was like, I don't want to take that. I was like, I'll take it. You know, I'm thrilled to see regulatory experimentation with the DSA. I am still an American lawyer, though, so my expertise on the policy issues here is really in the US. That being said, I think it's going to be really difficult because, you know, I'll give you an example. With some of the early transparency requirements that the DSA requires in the EU, there has been wide latitude in how private companies responded. Some companies sent in 7 pages on what their content moderation and other enforcement practices are. And then other companies, one in particular, sent in over 300 pages. I think really the ethos being, you know, kind of bury the lead somewhere, like, you know, bury them in paperwork. And that's just one example of what I think are ultimately ways that the enforcement and implementation of something like the DSA in the EU is going to prove difficult. And that is because, as the woman who asked the question said, incentives. Every incentive goes against transparency. Every incentive goes against putting users before profit. And so that's ultimately the model we have to shift. I mean, if we were, this is the last thing I'll say, if we were to just tax, for example, the top billionaires in the US, 1/10 of 1% of their money, 1/10 of 1%, they would, first of all, never know, and that could fund billions of dollars for a public media fund that could then provide an alternative to what we're seeing where companies are really, you know, hiding what they're doing in regulatory frameworks like the DSA. I am excited to see how it goes, and I think we're still a long way away. Happy to talk separately about the DSA with anyone because there's a lot more there.
Thanks. Yes. Hi.
Great talk today, thank you. This is for Deja and Nora. What advice would you give the everyday social user in regards to commenting on a post? I had a situation a while ago where I was innocently commenting on a post, and the backlash of negative comments really scared me.
Thank you. Deja, go.
Yeah. When we think about who's a content creator, we think about folks like me who get on camera, straight to camera, and chat. But in truth, we are all content creators in this environment. Writing a comment is a piece of content that you are creating and putting out there, and that opens you up to that kind of harassment and response. And here's the thing. We are all incentivized differently, right? Like brands on social want you to comment. Content creators like me want you to comment. The algorithms, the companies profit when you do engage. But, you know, sometimes it's just not worth the fight. And that is to say that those people that are fighting with you in the comments don't know you. And I was trained as a grassroots organizer in relational organizing, the idea that the people who care about you will care about what you care about. So you are better suited sending that to your family group chat or your kids or your neighbors or next door or whatever than you are fighting with people who do not know you in the comments. Like, we need to be saving our energy to move the people that we have sway over.
Awesome. Do you want to add anything, Nora? You've got.
I'm happy to share with you some materials afterwards because I think how you communicate with people is essential, and mostly it's really hard to bring people in. It's really hard. And, the phrase, don't call them out, call them in. No matter how much you call people in, it's really difficult. So some of it is the personal calculus of how much is it worth it to me to withstand hate or attack. And other times, make sure you're right. Because so much of the time, people will get into bickering and they'll both be wrong. So there's just a range of media literacy tips on how to connect and how to just really talk to people. Like, they're real people. And our anonymity, while I support it, has helped create a lot of this kind of vitriol and ability and willingness to be hateful.
Thanks. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you all for being here, for putting yourselves out there. I know it's difficult to do, and thank you, Lush, for putting your money where your mouth is, leading by example. Whether I disagree or agree with it doesn't really matter. I love companies that are willing to do that. To play a little devil's advocate, I'm really passionate about kind of both sides, and I hate to use the word sides, coming together, having discussions. The topic of your panel was, is it free speech or hate speech? I don't remember the exact wording, but I was kind of personally hoping that you might have a free speech absolutist on your panel. Again, there are, I'm not talking about a Andrew Tate asshole kind of person, excuse my language, but there are people that can have that discussion. And so I was just wondering, when you were putting this panel together, did you think about having kind of the other side reflected? And what was the thought process there?
Sure. Did you want to respond to that, Jack, or did you?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think where we are as a business and, like you say, putting our money where our mouth is, we're focused on trying to kind of provide some perspective that I do feel is getting lost with some of the more oppressed voices. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be that. I do think in some ways, it's great feedback, and I think in future we could look at that as a way to obviously open up debate. I love a good debate. I would have loved to have had a face-to-face, and we could really go for it. I think it's the other challenge is we've had an hour, right? And it's a big topic, and just trying to get the different perspectives across from the panel we do have, I think, is already quite a big challenge to undertake. And the freedom of speech versus freedom to hate thing for me as well is also just that we've seen a lot of, I think the freedom of speech thing for me, when you're talking about reproductive rights and those things, and those challenges where things are getting censored, that for me is something that we're seeing is real. And I don't believe that the censorship is happening on the other side. I think that the freedom of speech element of those people who are very, very vocal about it, they're getting their freedom of speech. There's not really any censorship on the topics they're discussing. It's the other areas that are getting more and more censored, shut down, and the inability to communicate. So, long answer. But I think in future it's worth thinking about and making sure we do have some kind of way to balance that debate. Could be a whole separate one. But thank you for the question.
Can I add something?
I can feel it.
Okay. Well, that's so funny to hear. People always call me a free speech absolutist, so I'm fascinated. And my former life litigating always was working on First Amendment cases. I think there's a kind of assumption in the question, and I'm really curious, like, what does the other side mean? There are lots of sides, and we know that neutrality is considered a North Star in reporting. It's also been widely seen as a tool for white supremacy. And when things like news coverage or journalists or editors that say, we're going to be really neutral here, that often means let's make sure that all of those quoted in our news article support a certain view. And so I really question what the other side or both sides is at all. There are so many sides. There are so many ways people come to think about hate. We didn't even get to talk about my own personal or our views on regulatory schemes on hate speech, which I think are very complex and I often disagree with. But the fundamental premise that the systems we're talking about on this panel are rigged against users, I think is one that we have to all become more literate around and help understand and talk through. And that isn't about a conservative or a liberal or a certain political viewpoint. It's that the people who own these are weaponizing those platforms for their own personal interests so that they don't get taxed as much or so that they have a kind of protection politically. So I'm happy to talk separately about it, but I think it's one that I would probe, what does the question really mean? And are we all practicing neutrality? Are we practicing a kind of both sidesing when ultimately what we need to talk about is power?
Thanks. We're going to get a red light real soon. So for you two folks, can you both ask your questions real quick? And if they can do, yes, we'll try, but ask your questions. I want to hear it.
My question is to you, Nora. You mentioned coming together, and I'm intrigued how we move audiences anymore. It feels like the future is so fractured and siloed. I think about Reddit and Discord. What does it look like to try and shift public opinion when folks are picking their brands, picking their platforms? How do we do it?
Thanks. Next, yeah.
Hi, my name's Julie Skelfo. I'm a longtime journalist, and I'm the founder of MAMA, Mothers Against Media Addiction. And we're a grassroots movement of parents and allies fighting back against media addiction and creating a world where real-life experiences stay at the heart of childhood. And I'm telling you that because the youth mental health crisis in the United States is so out of control that we realized unless we get our media addiction under control, kids are going to be hurt, and they're continuing to be hurt. And my question is, when are brands going to recognize that unless we get the media environment under control, there's going to be no businesses left? So I just want to know when more brands are going to do what Lush is doing and understand that they have to take a stand for a healthier media ecosystem.
Yeah, I want to know that too. When are more brands going to do what we're doing, guys?
Yeah, so practical tips question, a crystal ball question, real quick, and then...
I mean, I don't even know if that question's for me, but it's a great one. We have to tell stories, you know, we have to like make people care about each other. If it isn't personal, who cares? Like literally people will not care about a given topic. And so we have to truly build up curiosity and empathy, but that's very difficult. So I think luckily we have people like Deja who have a huge platform, and at the end of the day, this is still about power and platform, not just social media platforms, but the ability to have a voice and use that voice. And so I hope not only that Lush can continue doing what they're doing, but that maybe this is the start of our working with more brands, you know, building power where we haven't seen it, and for companies that typically didn't use their voice, really using it. It's kind of like a muscle that, you know, we haven't used in maybe a long time or ever, and I'm like, let's use that. Like, let's get buff.
Julie, right? Yeah, I'd also say, you know, we always say at Lush, like, feel free to use us, right? Like, if you're talking to other companies, tell them about what we did. We'll talk to anyone about what we did and why we did and what the impacts have been and you know, how we've kind of had our conversations are grown as a business.
And I think that links a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about. I think the more and more people and businesses like ourselves and like other organizations who are either platforms themselves, we start talking and we actually start getting some dialogue going between how do we start bridging these gaps? How do we limit the fractious nature of this? You know, we're looking at, in my opinion, the fall of some pretty big giants. There should be some pretty interesting fallout from that, where how do we pick up the pieces collectively and where do we go with this? So hopefully there'll be more interaction and more communication.
Great, thanks. Deja, any last words? Not to put you on the spot.
In true organizer sense, I fear we should have a call to action.
Yes,
Let's do it.
And my call to action for you all would be to get personal, right? If you're looking for where you get started, whether it's on this issue or another that you care about, I just want you to take a moment and think about what your personal story is. I've gotten vulnerable in front of you today, shared some things that I hope moved you, and I hope that you can find that there is a story that only you can uniquely tell. And I want you to go back to your personal network, right? Your family, your friends, your neighbor, the people who have buy-in in you, because to be honest, they might follow me, they might not, but they are not going to care about what I have to say like they care about their cousin or their auntie or their neighbor. So I need you to get personal, get that personal story down, and go out into your personal network and start having those conversations. And thank you for listening today.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much. Thanks for sticking with us a little over. Thank you for your time. The last thing I'll say, Lush has a second activation at 6th and Red River, talking about another epidemic, the crisis of school shootings. So please come and join us there. We're today from 12 to 6, tomorrow from 12 to 6, and that's at 6th and Red River. It's called Bloom a New Day in your apps. Thanks. Thanks, everyone.